Tolerance is a crime when what is tolerated is evil. Thomas Mann. The world is now watching in horror as torture and mass graves are uncovered in Syria's human slaughterhouse, Sydnaya Prison. We are talking about a horrific prison where tens of thousands of people were systematically executed and where the human mind can never even conceive of evil. And we will be talking about it for a very long time. In fact, the whole of Syria has been a human slaughterhouse for years. Throughout its rule, the Ba'ath regime, a group of minorities in power, had been inflicting unprecedented torture, tyranny, and, to put it in the most accurate way, ethno-sectarian cleansing on the Syrian people. And everyone knew it. Even those who ignored the victims of a war that has been going on since 2011 knew it. The simians who humiliated and oppressed both the victims, the combatants, and the refugees at every opportunity knew it very well. And the ones who knew best were those who lived with deep-seated hatred of Islam. They were all part of the evil, and probably not much will change in their lives, and they will continue to live with this rotten ordinary evil. If anyone says they didn't know, remember Plato's definition of evil. Plato saw evil as lack of virtue and lack of knowledge. For him, evil was a kind of ignorance of reality, virtue, and goodness. In one of the prisons, a medieval body press was found to break bones, reminiscent of Inquisition torture. This was just one of the instruments of torture. Refugees were people fleeing from this brutality and persecution, and the vast majority of asylum seekers were women and children. The women's biggest fear was the torturing rapists. That's why they were all trying to preserve their lives, their dignity, and their hope while seeking refuge in other lands. Unfortunately, not all of them were safe. Some were met with hardships and bullies. Some of those who were lucky enough not to drown in the seas were subjected to racism and violence. They have struggled to survive, and most difficult of all, to stand with dignity. This test is not over yet. Turkey was one of the first countries to welcome Syrian migrants. The vast majority of the migrants were women and children. If they had stayed in Syria, many of them would not be alive today. Or they would have been subjected to all kinds of torture in one of those horrible human slaughterhouses without trial. The Syrian Network for Human Rights, SNHR, has recorded thousands of rapes of adult women and girls under the age of 18 in regime detention centers. These are only recorded data. However, it is known that the actual number of women and children detained and raped is much higher than these figures. So, do you remember any women's movement, association, or actions defending, protecting, and protecting Syrian women and girls seeking refuge in Turkey? Or have you heard a word or two from famous women? Maybe a few weak statements, phrases that roll around in the mouth, but are never clear. But no grounded protest, no action, no shouts heard on the streets. 2 years ago, when 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died in custody in Iran, there were protests in Turkey. Women showed their reactions on many platforms, including social media. The death of a young woman saddened us all, of course. But strangely enough, the same sensitivity was never shown to Syrian women who were murdered, displaced, harassed, and raped, just as it was never shown to Palestinian women and children. Remember just 2 murders of women. Imani al-Rahmoun, a Syrian woman who escaped from Syria and settled in Sakarya''s Kaynarca district, was raped and murdered along with her 10-month-old baby. In Menemen district of Izmir, a 30-year-old pregnant woman, Manar, was murdered along with her 5-year-old child. All hell should have broken loose, but it didn't. Feminists in Turkey and famous women with lots of fans and followers somehow managed to ignore them. There was only one explanation for this. Because these women were not secularo enough. The main object of feminism is the woman, and advocacy for women's rights is essentially advocacy for human rights, advocacy for humanity. However, except for a small part, feminism in Turkey, the so-called women's rights advocacy, is political, biased, ideological, and hypocritical. Turkey's feminists always remind me of the famous Renaissance painting, The Parable of the Blind, also known as The March of the Blind. In the painting, Flemish painter Bruegel interpreted Jesus' words about the Pharisees, bigoted Jews. They are blind guides who lead the blind, Jesus says in the Gospel. In this successful reference by Bruegel, we see blind beggars clinging to each other's sticks and heading towards a pit with their guide. Not physically, but most of us see and are aware of that pit that everyone who experiences conscious blindness falls into. As we witnessed the tears of Samira, the mother of 13-year-old Hamza al-Khatib, who was tortured to death and had his limbs amputated on May 21, 2011 in Dara, Syria,